I hope I'm audible to everybody. Yeah. So good afternoon, everyone. And good evening, a very good evening to you, ma'am. It's a pleasure welcome you to our exclusive workshop on Global to Local. Today, we have the honor of hosting a distinguished guest. As you all know, that we have Miss Helena Norberg Hodge, founder and director of Local Futures from Australia with us. So she's in the field of local economics and has dedicated her life's work to the promotion of sustainable and community-focused living, right? So her insights on the topic are just invaluable, and we are fortunate that we have her with us today. So what I'll do is that without any further delay, I will just let's warmly welcome her. So very welcome to the session, ma'am, from the behalf of Blue World. And here we are with the teenagers who will love to start off and embark on this enlightening session or enlightening journey together. And thank you so much. I'll just hand over the same to you.
Thank you. Very happy to be here. And maybe we should just start with a moment of closing our eyes and appreciating where we are and who we are. And so just for one moment, close our eyes and take some deep breaths. And I said that I wanted you to close your eyes to also appreciate not just where you are, but who you are. Because one of the most important things that I've learned over 50 years of working on these issues is that we have a dominant system, a system that started in the West by Westerners hundreds of years ago. And that is what we can broadly define as an economic system, but it's a techno-economic system. And that system is robbing us of our self-esteem, of our unique identity, of our respect and love for ourselves. Now, I learned this by being in the culture of Ladakh, which I think most of you will be familiar with. It's the westernmost part of Tibet that belongs politically to India. And I think many of you come from areas which may be a bit similar, and especially in Bhutan or Nepal. But when I arrived in Ladakh in 1975, people had not been influenced by the narrative, by the story that's being told in the mainstream around the world today. So people had a deep sense of self-respect. They felt that they were fine the way they were. In no way did they feel inferior to Westerners. In no way did they feel that they have to work really hard to improve themselves and have lots of degrees or get wealthy to be somebody. I was so privileged to learn to speak the language fluently and to experience that that's how people felt, young and old. But I also had the, I don't want to say privilege, but the burden of living in Ladakh as this outside culture came in. And in many ways, I've been arguing that we shouldn't call it a culture because it's actually born of the marriage between technology, and technology includes money, and a military industrial complex that after the Second World War has been pushed particularly by America, by American intelligence, working with high tech and finance, pushing worldwide a culture, you might call it, but it's a consumer culture it is an urban consumer culture that makes everybody who is living closer to the land, closer to intergenerational community, makes people feel inferior. So I witnessed this change in Ladakh, and I was out in that part of the world for 2 years. And then I went back to my native country of Sweden. And I suddenly realized that in Sweden too, people were being made to feel inferior. And it was affecting young people in particular. Already by the age of 3 or 4, the influence could be seen. And the influence was that if you don't have the latest label of clothing or running shoes, or at that time it wasn't an iPhone, but it was other gadgets. If you don't have that, you're not worth anything. And I saw that particularly with the younger generation, the effect led to depression, and in both Ladakh and Sweden, India, Korea, America, around the world, we have an epidemic of depression among young people. And I would say that that depression and that loss of self-esteem is probably worst in America, but it's more or less, you can look at how severe the problem is by looking at the level of industrialization, commercialization, technology, and separation. People are being pushed into the city, and they no longer have grandparents around, aunts and uncles, cousins, siblings, more and more isolated in a small nuclear family. And what we're seeing is this epidemic of depression that's connected to epidemics of loneliness. I hope that all of you will look at our films. We have a film called Ancient Futures that looks at this change in Ladakh, but also talks about the change in the West. We have a film called The Economics of Happiness, and that's been translated into, I think, about 30 languages. My book, Ancient Futures, and the film Ancient Futures have been translated into more than 40 languages. And around the world, from Nepal to Bangladesh to Laos, and of course, yeah, Japan, Korea, America, we've been told that this story is the same story. But in many countries, the destruction started much earlier. So one of the most important things you can do is to inform yourself about this, not to develop a hatred of the West or hatred of Westerners, but to realize that it's so important that we connect across the boundaries of developed versus so-called undeveloped, the West versus Asia or South America, that we connect more deeply to have a deeper discussion about what makes us happy, what are our real needs. In the film, The Economics of Happiness, you'll see that we describe rebuilding local economies, local community as a foundation for happiness. But paradoxically, one of the best ways to do that is through more international dialogue, more collaboration between what you might call the West and non-Western cultures, between, again, developed so-called versus less developed so-called. We need much better understanding. And what's happening is that the mobile phone, the internet, social media are not actually helping us communicate deeply and in a meaningful way. The social media has become a way of competing, trying to show that we're all having a wonderful time, we're so happy, we have all these gadgets, but it's actually making us feel more lonely and more cut off. So we need to have a very deep discussion about these issues. And as we show in the films, the problem is that we have had a growth in the power of global banks and global corporations linked to high-tech finance and the military. And in that global economy, global businesses have no regulations. There are no laws, no rules determining their behavior, and they pay no taxes. In the meanwhile, all around the world, you and I, small businesses, medium-sized businesses, even big industries that are place-based, that belong to India or Nepal or Sweden or America, those businesses are squeezed with regulations and taxes. So we have a completely unfair economy. Now, how are we going to change that? You know, we can think there's nothing we can do about that. No point talking about it. Those businesses and banks are so powerful. The only reason they have power is because there's such ignorance about this. Because at the local level, businesses and individuals blame themselves, blame their own culture for not being more effective, for not being more wealthy. So, most important of all is an activism that I call big picture activism. And that big picture activism is when we share that understanding that our governments are handing over power to global banks and corporations that don't pay tax and that have no regulations, and that this is the main reason, not just behind epidemics of depression among people, and especially young people, but it's the main reason behind climate change, behind toxic pollution, the toxicity, including the pesticides and the fungicides, chemical fertilizers, the main reason for cancer, the main reason for Alzheimer's, for Parkinson. There's a lot of evidence, but we don't get to hear about it. We also need to understand that one of the best ways of understanding that the global economy is so destructive and more localized economies can turn things around. One of the best ways to understand it is to study food and farming and to focus on shifting the food economy. We have on our website, which is localfutures.org, we have a little film called Local Food Can Save the World. And in that film, we discuss many of the problems of the global food economy. But we actually don't talk enough about the health effects in terms of the fact that global business are pushing high fructose corn syrup, trans fats and very unhealthy carbs on children. In America, this now means that the younger generation is dying before the parent generation. They're dying younger because they have diabetes, heart disease, problems with blood pressure, and it's because of the diet. So once you start looking at the bigger picture, you will be convinced that the global economy is responsible for most of the problems we face. And more localized economies are what we call solution multipliers. So I really hope that you will look at this big picture, that you will share it, and that you will both connect locally with like-minded people. You can maybe show one of our films or other films, and you can discuss what can we do to make ourselves happier and healthier and improve the state of the world. The big picture will help you to see that what you can do will also bring benefits to you. So I think we have a very, very positive message to share. At first, it can feel a bit big, to look at the global economy, it can feel a bit overwhelming. But once you understand that even in terms of changing the global economy, it's not as difficult as we are led to believe. It is about us building a movement where we talk about poverty as well as climate, as well as illness, as well as the loss of democracy. And we know that it's affecting Americans as well as Indians, Swedes as well as people from Bangladesh. So we can have a global voice that is very uniting. And it's not about making some kind of hatred or demonization of global businesses and banks. It's not about creating a them and us. Many people who work in those corporations are not aware of the overall big picture. They are not aware of how destructive it is what they do. It's up to us from the grassroots and involving young people to really look at this and share the message. And we do have to recognize that allowing global business to pay no tax and have no rules is very, very destructive and dangerous. And that becomes an evil system. The system is evil. The damage it's doing is terrible. The people inside it are not evil. So we can have a very kind and compassionate, non-violent message that is just very clear that all of humanity will be better off if business is subjugated to democratic process, if business has rules determined by society, not business creating this consumer culture that is destructive on so many different levels. No, society concerned about our happiness, our health, the health of the environment. And of course, we know that we and the rest of the earth are one. We are one. What we do to nature to poison and pillage is poisoning and pillaging us. So once we come with a message of oneness, a united message, a spiritual message, a psychological message, an ecological message, we can create enough power to insist that this situation where corporations tell our governments what to do changes to our governments telling business what to do. But we have to realize right now, most of our governments are not going to listen unless there is a people's movement, a strong voice. And we need to have international negotiations, new trade treaties, and we need to have at the table members of the teen parliament, members of the environmental movement, members of the social movements, not Coca-Cola and Monsanto and Union Carbide, but those who represent the well-being of people and the planet. I think I'll stop there, and I hope that you have some questions or comments so we can have a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you so much for enlightening the students with all the knowledge that you shared. We'll just be taking the questions from the teens right now. Just give me a moment. Okay, so what I'll do is, ma'am, that I'll be sharing the questions in the chat box, and then accordingly, you will just, I'll just reading it out for you as well. So then you can just address the students and the answers that they will be getting it. Okay, so ma'am, we have the first question. So I'll be taking the first question from Thakur Rudra Pratap. Okay, so the question that he wants to ask is that considering the interconnected world we live in, how can teens from different cultures collaborate creatively to address local challenges, making our collective impact both profound and culturally enriching? So he is from Stone Ridge International School, Rudrapur, India.
Well, it's really through this kind of communication. So there are international programs that connect people across the world. And I think it's very important that your teen parliament should include members of the so-called developed world to hear an honest, really honest story of what's happening there. Because honestly, I see more poverty, I see more depression, I see more severe mental illness in America than I do in India. And it's you know, we get the illusion that America is this model that we all want to follow. And even in Sweden, people believe that America is worth following. America has the worst poverty anywhere in the world. So we need to hear the true story. We need to understand why the unhappiness, why are people so lonely, where are the illnesses coming from, why are young people dying now younger than their parents? Because we have a dominant narrative all the time selling us on progress. So we need to connect and share stories, and we should also be aware that the speeding up using 5G or even 6G to speed up communication is not desirable, because as our governments are signing on to agreements to use more technology, more energy, most of that technology helps the financial casino, the speculation that speculates on our life, that is making the majority of people actually poorer. Even in the middle classes around the world, you now have to work more hours to just pay the rent or the mortgage, have a roof over your head, food on the table. You're having to work longer hours. And those facts have been documented by economists in England and America, showing how as economic growth is going up, the average person was having to work more hours per day, more months in the year, in order just to cover basic needs like a roof over their head and food on the table. But this reality we don't normally hear about. But one of the things I just wanted to warn about is that we want to communicate and we should use these tools, but simultaneously lobby against further infrastructure, more speeding up, because it helps the financial casino more than it helps us. We can communicate even with slightly slower tools than we have now. We do not want to speed up. We don't want AI, because AI will help the dominant corporate system much more than us. We want to have human-to-human contact.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I hope that the team must have understood the answer, and it's very fortunate for him to get the answer from yourself directly. So I'll just take the second question then.
Yeah.
Yeah, so ma'am.
Yeah, shall I read it out? If you were on a mission to promote diverse cultures,
Ma'am,
protect by
question, I'll just send in the next question. Okay, so ma'am, the next question is that what can be the ways? So I'll just send the same in the chat box also. What can be the ways to integrate sustainable practices into education, empower young people to participate in local decision-making, and foster a sense of responsibility for environmental and social well-being, also strategize to engage and mobilize you?
Well, again, this is all about trying to get these discussions happening at the local level. It's about changing education, and we need your help. We also need the help of adults, because the system that our government supports are pushing more STEM, science and technology subjects, in academia. Governments are saying we've got to be more competitive in the global economy. That means they're training you to be employed by global corporations. So you're getting trained for a very narrow, specialized, technological approach. Subjects that are very, very important, like really healthy food production, farming, health, that is about health, not about pharmaceuticals. This more holistic approach is getting buried. And so we have to be aware of that, and we have to lobby for changes in education.
Yeah, thank you so much, ma'am. So this question came from Mayank Rai. I hope you can hear me, ma'am.
Yeah.
Yeah, so he's from India. I'll take this third question, and the question says that as supporters of sustainable living and local economies, what steps can we as youth take to encourage and put into place more accountable and localized economic systems in the face of the society that is becoming more globalized? So this question comes from SK Olivia, who is from Calcutta, India.
Well, see, again and again, it comes back to what I call big picture activism. We are often not aware of how much brainwashing is going on, how much the narrative of consumer progress, higher and higher tech, ever larger cities, urbanization is part of this part. We need the opposite. We need to support smaller cities, even villages. We need to support more localized food systems for genuine food security. On smaller, diversified farms, we can produce far more per unit of land, per unit of water. We've been fed a lie that fossil fuel-based industrial agriculture is more efficient, can feed more people. It's a lie. And there's a lot of evidence, but it doesn't get out into mainstream academia or mainstream media. So again, you have to both look for independent, holistic, truly systemic, and global information, so that you're not too locked into too local a perspective. Because to understand the global system, You need to know more about what's going on in other countries, particularly in the so-called developed. So looking for that information and sharing it, that is the activism. That is the most important thing you can do to then start, even at a school or university, you could work to influence one professor perhaps to take up some of these issues. You can look for alternative courses that maybe are not part of your regular education, but you actually actively seek this more honest and more holistic, more grounded perspective.
Shravan, thank you so much. So I'll take the next question if you allow. So the next question comes from Thong Sandra, who is from Kuala Lumpur itself. And she is from Saiful International School. She's asking, what is the best example of global to local?
The best example of global to local is millions of localized food economies all around the world. Now, the localized food economies still exist in many of your countries, but they're being destroyed very quickly. But they are economies where the distance from the farm and the plate is not so great. They are places where small farmers are feeding themselves and their communities. They are now, most importantly, new local economy systems brought in by activists in the West. So I've helped to start many in America, in Australia, in particularly Australia, America, and England, but also in other countries, in the Czech Republic, in Romania. And so there, people have worked hard to try to create new farmers markets where small farmers can sell. Very often, those markets might be in a city, but they're linking that city with the farmers in the region, which is the opposite of what governments are doing. Governments are subsidizing large monocultures for export. And that's what's happening in your countries. And it's happening all around the world. And small farmers are being destroyed, and then they're pushed into the city where they live in slums and where they often have no reliable or meaningful work. So beware also that the path that mainstream education gives you is a path towards a very competitive, very difficult situation in the city. If you work really hard, you might succeed, but you'll be working much harder than you should. You'll be living in a city without a quality of life, and your health, both physical and mental health, will suffer. So, yeah, as I said, the best examples of more localized economies and systems is in this food movement. And I'm so happy that I've helped to start many, and that there are very beautiful examples of much healthier, more productive land, much more enjoyable work as a farmer, because the people, the consumers who are helping to start this are valuing farming as one of the most important livelihoods. So you see, this is the opposite of what's going on in your countries, that farming is becoming really high status. Very often, people who study to become lawyers or high-tech engineers are leaving to become farmers. And many of them even are Silicon Valley millionaires who leave that work and who warn us about the dependence on the social media. They don't want their children anywhere near a computer or a mobile phone. And they want to connect to nature and to community, to feel connected to other people.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Ma'am, if you allow, then we can take 2-3 questions directly from the audience after this last question that I'm putting forth. Ma'am, is it fine?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So if anybody who wants to ask questions, so whatever question you have for ma'am, you can put them in the chat, and we'll select 2 or 3, and then we'll be taking it forward. Okay. But now I'll just put on the last question that I have. So the question says, and it comes from Saskia Puneet, who is from Grand Gob MU, and how can youth actively engage and collaborate with local communities to implement sustainable health practices, ensuring a harmonious blend of global insights and cultural preservation?
Well, again, it's so important that you try to change the I to a we. So I would say the first step is, if you're also thinking this dominant path is not so good, try to find a like-minded friend. It could be someone older, it could be someone younger, it could be someone from the family, but try to find at least one other person, maybe 2 or 3 or even up to 20, so that instead of thinking, what can I do, you're thinking, what can we do? And I think one of the first steps then is to look at some of these films or read some of these books to discuss among yourselves. And then look at what can you do jointly. That then becomes so much easier and more enjoyable. Because if you want to try to influence what's happening in your local community or wherever you are, just on your own, when you have this whole system full of propaganda, it's very difficult to counter. You need to have a stronger voice by being a we rather than just one person.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I hope that the questions was answered well, and it was very much answered well, and the kids must have got their answer. What I'll do is that we'll just be taking some questions from the chat, as I said. So, ma'am, you can pick the questions. So there are so many questions coming in. So the questions which are there, you can pick any of them.
Okay, I can pick any of them. They keep moving, so I can't. They have to.
Shall I do it for you, ma'am?
Okay, because they're moving all the time. I can't read.
Yeah. So they are asking in so many questions.
I see here one. How can we effectively bridge the gap between global concern and local solutions by using the influence of MPs and influencers? How can we build a collaborative and sustainable approach for good change in communities worldwide? Well, the gap between global concerns and local solutions is a very good way to put it, because the global problems are generated from a global system that, remember, it started with slavery and enclosures. This global system started by destroying people's ability to produce for themselves. It destroyed self-reliance, or rather community reliance, by driving people away from producing a range of things for themselves to produce for the traders. And they were slave traders, and they imposed genocide on people that didn't go along with it. So it's a very evil system. And back then, as this really started growing into the system in the 1600s and 1700s, the men who were in charge were pretty despicable. They were overtly racist, they were misogynist, they were anti-nature. But today, it's changed into this big system where people don't see what they're doing, with specialized science, specialized financial focus, everyone looking narrowly. So today, most MPs and most influencers that are there are not trained enough to understand this. So again, you need to look for people, and normally it's not going to be your MP. It might be an uncle, it might be a grandfather, it might be a professor, could be an exceptional MP, but the process that I see growing around the world that's very hopeful is much more grassroots. And by the way, it's a lot of women who take the initiative. The women feel more concerned about health and about environmental health, about social relationships, about happiness and psychology. So we're talking about all of these aspects of life, health, and happiness. And so a lot of it starts with grassroots. And of course, there are also men. But I want to encourage also the women not to hesitate, but as I say, to try to link up with others. And I wouldn't, as I say, I would not start by trying to influence the MPs and the influencers, but rather growing the movement more horizontally. So there are people concerned with climate, there are people concerned with poverty, but they're not putting the big picture together. They're not focusing on changing the system, including education, including urbanization. They're not looking at that big picture. But if they do, they will see that whether you're concerned about climate or toxic pollution or poverty, depression, all of it links back to the same system. So then you can get lots of people collaborating. It could happen very quickly. The really big problem is how do you get that big picture out so more people see it? And then the MPs and the influencers will listen.
Thanks so much, ma'am, for answering the question. We'll take another one.
Okay. Okay, so this is again a similar question from Kashmir. You know, how can global trends or issues be effectively addressed at the local level to create meaningful impact and change within the communities? Again, it starts by understanding that the global trends are having a similar impact everywhere. They are driving up emissions, they are driving up insecurity, unemployment, and they're also driving up racism. So in the West, it's becoming more extreme polarization between people who are afraid of immigrants and who are becoming very racist. In the so-called less developed world, I've seen with my own eyes in Ladakh and Bhutan and actually many other places that as people are forced into the city and forced to compete for scarce jobs, it increases group conflict. It increases essentially violent conflict. So if we could understand that this system, by driving us in the city and suddenly creating a scarcity of jobs, in our entire evolution, unemployment never existed till this modern economy. And it's the same economy that makes a few people richer and richer and richer in India, in Sweden, in America. The billionaires are winning, but there are very few. The majority of people are suffering. So a lot of your questions are, not so much dealing with understanding the big picture of the global problem of the globalized system. And so what is the best way of raising awareness about that? So at the local level, we can do things differently. It requires an understanding that we have to move away from the dominant conventional schooling, from the assumption that urbanization is inevitable or necessary, from the assumption that in the city we use fewer resources. In the cities, we use many more resources than in the villages or smaller towns. Also, if you look at our materials, we have shown that we could have a development using renewable energy, but not the Green New Deal that's being pushed by big business, but using hydroelectricity, some solar, some wind, more sensible architecture, and more localized food systems that increase diversity and productivity. and the communication that raises self-respect, where we will be supporting each other in our cultural diversity, but having international communication. So we're not talking about withdrawing into a local where we don't have any development, we don't have any communication. We're talking about another picture, which you could best understand if you look at the global eco-village movement. The global eco-village movement started from Denmark. It was started by friends of mine, and I've been part of it from the beginning. And these are Westerners who want to live in a village. They want community, they want to be farming, they want to learn how to build with their own hands, but they're not necessarily going to go back to the really traditional, because you can benefit from certain technologies and communication. So it's now, that's a very important discussion of where would the balance be, and that will be different from place to place, but it will be so benefited by a better understanding that the dominant development path, the dominant path of progress is a dead end, and it's killing the planet, it's destroying democracy, it is destroying our health and our happiness. So this other path, we learn from indigenous cultures, as I did in Ladakh. We learn what are key elements of happiness, what are key elements of health, of ecosystems and people, and then we adapt technology to that. And that will mean also differences depending on climate, depending on what kind of native resources can thrive while still introducing change. So the dialogue we need to have will have to be quite sophisticated and born of quite a lot of international experience and international exchange. That's why I also welcome for you to be able to spend some time in the West as part of really learning and understanding what's happening. But not everyone can do that. But we had a program where we sponsored community leaders to go to the West to actually have a deeper dialogue and experience. And equally, Westerners coming to villages in the so-called global South.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I would request you to kindly enlighten the way you have answered the question. Thank you so much for that first. And I would request you to kindly enlighten the MPs and influencers of the World Teen Parliament with the concluding statement of yours.
Oh, you want me a statement to them?
Yes, ma'am. The statement, they can just get in the knowledge that, yes, this is what you got from the session.
Well, my statement is that, first of all, please don't blame yourself if you're not as happy as you'd like to be, if you're not doing as well as you think you should be doing. Be aware that you are facing a system that undermines your self-respect, that is demanding far too much of you as a student, because we're all being squeezed in this narrow path towards intense competition, speed, and a very narrow education for very narrow, boring, tedious work. Even doctors, teachers, psychiatrists in the West are having burnout, depression, suicide, because things have become so dehumanized, so speedy, that they don't even have time. A doctor doesn't even have time to look after his patient. He's now locked into looking at a whole mass of bureaucratic material and data, using the computer. When you go to see the doctor, he barely looks at you. He's sitting there typing in information for the top structures that are dominated by big business, that are dominated by science for profit. So all around the world, there's an alternative path being created And it's particularly instructive to see it in the West, because there you will see so many people who have succeeded, who realize how empty the urban consumer culture is. And they're doing everything they can to be closer to the land, closer to community, more intergenerational connection, more respect for traditional indigenous cultures, and trying to adjust technology and the economy to people's needs. It's what we call the economics of happiness. It's what we mean by systemic localization, economic localization. And that needs the help of international communication and exchange. So there are paradoxes here that you need to be informed about. And I hope that you will look at our website, localfutures.org, that you will learn from the eco-village movement, the permaculture movement, the bioregional movement, the local food movement in the West, that you also are familiar with Via Campesina, about 200 million small farmers who are raising awareness about the trade treaties and their destructive impact on all of our lives, particularly clearly in farming. I hope also that you'll remember that I said that one of the best ways to understand the difference between going towards more globalized economies or an economy towards more localized, one of the best ways to understand it is to look at food and farming. And one of the best ways to change them is to focus on changing the food economy. So I hope that many of you will look at joining that local food movement that's all around the world, that you might join our World Localization Day, which is in June, where people around the world celebrate the local economy and very often celebrating the local food economy. And they're doing that through international collaboration and exchange. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Before we conclude this enriching workshop and I would like to express our heartfelt gratitude that we have for you. And your insights and everything has been a beacon of inspiration, to be honest, and guiding us towards a more sustainable and community-oriented future. So on behalf of everyone, on behalf of Love World, on behalf of World Teen Parliament, thank you for sharing your expertise, your passion, and your time with us. Your presence has made this workshop a truly enlightenment experience. Thank you so much for answering all the questions to the teens, and thank you once again.
Thank you all, and I wish you all the best of luck, and I hope we'll hear from you at Local Futures.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Take care.